In the last video, we looked at the master page, and today we're going to move on to looking at effects. But first of all, I need to grab a sound from the browser to help me demonstrate. Doesn't have to be too exciting. I reckon an electric piano will do. It's very important that it's a dry sound because we're going to go ahead and add effects to it, so we don't want it to have effects on already. And I'm going to go for this FM Rhodes. Perfect. Okay, so let's hit the effects page. Okay, there are 12 different effects in Native Instruments FM8. There's overdrive, tube amp, cabinet, shelving EQ, peak EQ, talk wire, phaser, flanger, tremolo, reverb, psych delay, and chorus delay. The order in which they appear on this list and in our little effects rack is basically the order in which they're routed. Overdrive into tube amp into cabinet, shelving EQ, etc. And you can't change that order. Obviously, you don't have to use them all. You can use as many or as few as you want, but you can only use one instance of each effect. You can't have two different overdrive units in one patch, for example. You've only got the one. Personally, I reckon that's quite sufficient. Okay, so a lot of these effects might be very similar to other plugins you've used. You might be quite familiar with the concept, but in case you're not, I'm just going to go through and explain what they all do. We've got overdrive for some pretty nice, warm, smooth distortion. You've got a drive control to add more or less distortion. We've got this tone knob to brighten the sound. And bass adds a bit of low end to the sound. And a basic volume knob. We've got tube amp, which simulates a guitar tube amplifier. Very, very simple, just the two controls, volume and drive. We've got cabinet, which simulates a guitar cab, and you can cycle using these buttons through the different types of amp cab it's simulating. And in brackets underneath the name of the amp, you've also got the mic placement that it's simulating. And you've got size, which theoretically is kind of making the cabinet bigger or smaller. You've got air, which kind of adds a bit of kind of reflections and resonance to the sound. And you've got tone controls, bass and treble, fairly straightforward. As you can probably imagine, cabinet works really well in conjunction with tube amp to kind of simulate a guitar amp setup. We've got a shelving EQ, very straightforward. You can use these little squares to decide what frequency you're setting your shelf at and how much you're boosting or cutting it by. What you don't have control of is the Q curve. And there's a knob for overall volume as well. There's a peak EQ. In this, you do have control over the Q curve as well as the frequency and gain. So you can boost or cut, narrow or wide. There's a talk wire. This is great fun. It basically uses a formant filter to emphasize the frequencies of vowel sounds. The size knob controls the size of our virtual mouth. And the best way to describe this mouth control really is to say that it essentially goes kind of from an oo sound to an R sound to an E sound. And you can click this button to use the mod wheel to modify that. This bright button just adds a lot of treble to the signal. We've got a phaser. You can control the rate with this rate knob. You can invert the phase of the signal. You can hit this sync button so that it will synchronize with the tempo of the song. This notches control basically makes the sound more extreme by adding more stages to the phasing. You can alter the timbre of the sound with this colour knob. Sweep min and sweep max basically set the upper and lower limit for the frequency sweep. So if you want to go really extreme, you could put the sweep min right down and the sweep max right up. This rotate knob gives it a nice kind of stereo effect. And we've got a dry wet control here, so we can go from totally dry, no effect at all, to totally wet, none of the dry signal mixed in at all. So that's phaser. We've got a flanger, similar kind of effect but a little bit different. Again, we've got rate and sync buttons to control the rate, and again we can invert the phase of our signal. Static just turns the modulation off. I prefer it with a bit of movement, so I'd rather have static off. You've got depth, that'll control the amount of modulation. You've got colour to change the timbre. Rotate for a nice kind of stereo effect. And a dry wet knob. So that's flanger. We've got tremolo, very simple, just modulates the amplitude. We've got a rate and a sync knob. We've got intensity, so by how much it's changing the amplitude. We've got width to make the stereo field more or less extreme. And we've got attack and decay. So if these were both set right down, it's almost like a gating effect. And we've got a reverb, fairly straightforward. Got a time knob to control the length of the reverb decay. And two different tone controls for the high frequencies. We've got this bright knob and this treble knob. And we've got a dry wet control. And we've got psych delay. You can get a load of mad effects by playing around with this. It's got similar controls to a normal delay. You've got time. And you've got a sync button to sync it to the tempo. Or you've got a tap tempo button. Feedback control. Stereo control for the stereo field. Detune control, which is a fairly subtle kind of pitch shift. Or if you want more extreme pitch shifting, you've got this pitch button over here. Dry wet control, and my favourite, which I haven't forgotten about, the reverse control. I think the psych delay is really cool to use on vocals, and we're going to do that later in the video on using FM8 as an effects plugin in your DAW. Right now though, I'm going to show you the last effect on the list, which is chorus/delay. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. When the time value is lower, it's kind of more of a chorus effect. You put the time higher, it's more like a delay. You can invert the signal or sync it. You've got diffusion, which can give it a kind of reverby effect if you turn up time. You've got a low cut knob to cut all the low frequencies, high cut to cut the high frequencies, feedback control, modulation rate and modulation depth, which can be synced using this sync button, and a dry wet control. So that's a very basic look at all 12 effects. We haven't really discussed using them creatively in patch design. We are going to do that in future videos. Just one last thing before we take a break. We've also got these really handy templates. So you can just go in and grab something like medium reverb or plate or something like that, or juicy tube saturation. And you can make your own templates if you want. What you have to do if you want to save a template is double click on the name, give it a title. Then you want to hit the S button and select an empty slot for it to go in. So now I could grab another template, call back up again our flanger and verb, just like that. Now that's not the same thing as creating an effect preset. We are going to do that in a later video when we look at using FM8 as an effect plugin in your DAW. In the next video though, we're going to move on to the arpeggiator, which is one of the most fun things in FM8.